The trouble with capitalism is capitalists. They're too damn greedy.
The central principle of capitalism is to be one step ahead of everyone else, to be the first to buy a stock that you think may ultimately appreciate in value, and then as others buy more and more of it, the price of that stock will realize a profit. To be the first to sell a highly priced stock before everyone else gets nervous and starts to dump their stock and the price comes down. In that case, you would lose your money if you weren't one step ahead of the herd. This is exactly what happens in October of 1929. Kind of panic sets in.
In a little over a month between September and October 1929, the U.S. stock market first slid, then crashed, causing economic disaster for investors, banks, and businesses.
By the last week of October, there are a series of massive trading days where stock values start to plummet. This triggers the Great Depression itself, one, because so many people lose their savings and their accumulated funds literally overnight. So when people lose all of this money, they start to buy less and less in the marketplace, obviously, and that further depresses the sales and the profitability of firms. The second reason this triggers a Great Depression, as we call it, is that as the stock market collapses, investors become much more pessimistic about the future. So even those investors who have some money on hand will sit back and say, well, I'm not going to invest now. And as more and more investors hold back this way, it only accelerates the process of collapse.
Many observers believed the effects of the crash would be short-lived and the economy would recover quickly. But as weeks turned into months and months into years, it became clear that the nation had entered an unprecedented economic depression.
This was both the deepest depression in American history and the longest in duration. And in some ways, it's the first economic crisis that this country faced when it was fully in the industrial era. And it's more vulnerable to this kind of shock than a less fully developed economy was earlier.
Can't get no way, can't draw no pay. Unemployment getting worse every day. Nothing to eat, no place to sleep. All night long, folks walking the street. Doggone, the panic is on.
Bad policies on the part of banking, business, and government greatly helped not only to cause the depression, but to prolong it.
When the value of stocks collapsed, banks lost their money. That's bad enough, but it wasn't just their money they were losing. It was the money of their depositors. So this is the cause of what's referred to as the great bank panics of the early 1930s, where people would rush to the bank in fear that their savings literally were gone. In many cases, they were.
There were in the United States in the 1920s 25,000 banks. 25,000 different banking corporations doing business, some of them doing business in areas no larger than a single county. So banks didn't have the resources and the reserves to weather a storm like this.
Some of the causes of the Depression were inherent in the nature of laissez-faire industrial capitalism itself. New technologies and management techniques had resulted in dramatic increases in productivity, which caused the supply of goods to greatly exceed demand. In order to remain profitable, many businesses had to cut jobs and wages.
The distribution of wealth and incomes was becoming increasingly unequal. There are a variety of reasons for this. One of them has to do with severe hardship in the agricultural sectors of the economy. Inadequate rainfall, drought, bad harvests. Some of it had to do with the impacts of mechanization and technological change that grew out of World War I. Finally, in the industrial areas, wages were not keeping up with profits. Now, by the time of the stock market crash in the fall of 1929, consumer spending was already weakened in the economy because consumers couldn't keep up the rate of growth in their spending on goods and services. When sales decline, profitability declines. And when profitability declines, you have the ingredients of a collapse, of a depression.
The Great Depression wasn't limited to the United States.
The Depression has to be understood as a global event. And many of the countries affected responded in a kind of reflex way by trying to protect themselves from the shocks that were roiling through the international system as a whole, by throwing up great, huge protective tariff barriers around their economies so that they could keep whatever business there was at home. In country after country, in the United Kingdom, in France, in Germany, the United States, Japan, all of them reverted to these protectionist and economically isolationist policies when the shock of the Depression happened. And in fact, that response helped both deepen and prolong the Depression.
The Hoover administration took some steps to mitigate the effects of the Depression, but they were too slow and too small to halt the rapidly spreading crisis. Hindsight is 20/20, but at the time, the Hoover administration did not fully grasp the scope of the problem.
The government, in fact, did not regularly compile things like unemployment statistics, so nobody knew for sure just exactly how big this crisis was. Now, it turns out by 1932-33, we think the unemployment numbers go up to about 13 million people, 1 out of every 4 workers. But nobody could really see that clearly because the data gathering services weren't there to report on it.
We have done all we can do. There is nothing more to be done.
Hoover's approach to the mass poverty of the Depression was to leave it to state and local authorities to deal with the problem. But states and towns were quickly overwhelmed by the thousands of unemployed, homeless, and hungry citizens.
To a degree, what Hoover was counting on was voluntarism. He really did think that church groups, that the local governments, that the state governments would rise to the occasion and take care of this extreme poverty created by the Depression. And it didn't work. He took the action that economists later said was correct to shore up the basic banking, credit, and financial system of the country. He did take that action. But the one component that was missing was this direct relief component. And it's because he believed in this voluntarism, and he was very disappointed in Americans, never really quite comprehending the severity of that depression on them and the impact that it was going to have on their ability to volunteer or to take care of themselves.